Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel today. My name is Dr. Alisha Hines. I am the Director of Research at the Center for Scholars and Storytellers, which is based and affiliated with the Department of Psychology via our founding director, Dr. Uhls, who you'll hear from today. I'm sure people are still shuffling in a bit, so I'll just say thank you first to Nicole and Hillary and Janice for helping us put this together, everyone at Life Sciences for helping us put this together today, and to the CSS team, to Grace and everyone over on our side who made this possible. So today, just to make sure everybody's in the right place, we are having a discussion around character strengths in storytelling for adolescents. Specifically, we're discussing a toolkit, a research-based toolkit that was launched by the Center for Scholars and Storytellers called Developing Good Humans, based on the character virtues, gratitude, humility, and curiosity. These character strengths in media, we believe, is extremely important for adolescent development as they foster self-awareness, positive relationships, and a deeper understanding of the world. And these virtues contribute to their overall emotional and social growth. So to have this conversation today, we have some amazing panelists. I'll be moderating the panel today. We're joined by Nancy Kanter, who's a veteran powerhouse entertainment executive. We've got Dr. Yalda Uhls here as well, who is the founding director, as I said, of CSS and a faculty member in the Department of Psychology, and one of our amazing, brilliant young people, an adolescent, Sarina, with us today to offer that really important and powerful perspective to this conversation. And so I'm going to allow the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the discussion.
Hi, I'm Nancy Kanter, and I'm thrilled to be here. Hope this will be helpful and informative and fun for everybody. I've been part of the Center for Scholars and Storytellers Advisory Board for several years. Yalda and I worked closely together when I was at Disney for about 20 years, leading the creative content and strategy for Disney Channel. And I've been over at Netflix for the last 3 years as a producer. And a lot of my work centers on teens and tweens and kids. So the work that the center does and the work that this toolkit, the advice this toolkit highlights, I think is extremely important. And I hope people will pay attention to it.
Hi, I'm Sarina Marzbani. I'm a high school freshman at Orange County School of the Arts, and I was part of the YMR program last year, and it was really exciting for me because I learned about media and psychology that goes into it. And since then, I created Read and Write to Unite, a project focused on promoting proper and accurate UNASA representation in children's literature. And I'm so excited to be here.
We're so excited to be here too. So thank you. I want to echo the thanks to the UCLA Life Science team for supporting this event, and to all of you for being here, and to Nancy Kanter for being an incredible support of our work since the beginning. And Sarina, YMR stands for Youth Media Representation. It's a program that we have at the Center for Scholars and Storytellers for adolescents. And we've had some amazing teens. It's a virtual program. And if you're interested in it, you can write us, or Grace Fang, who's here, can drop in some information about it in the chat. And thank you, Dr. Hines, our research director, for that very, very warm welcome. So why did we do this toolkit? Well, first of all, I want to thank our funder, the John Templeton Foundation. They generously funded this, and I have been focused on the positive impacts of media since I was working for the nonprofit called Common Sense Media. In that capacity, I learned that there was a lot of rich research on how media can positively impact young people. And they created, and you have this in our toolkit, Common Sense Media, and I was responsible for helping them do this, a list of different movies and shows that their reviewers believe support young people to learn all sorts of different things, such as teamwork, curiosity, gratitude, etc. So John Templeton was part of that. And because I was very thrilled because I obviously believe in media. I was a movie maker before I didn't do my introduction. So I'm Dr. Yalda T. Uhls. I'm the founder of the Center for Scholars and Storytellers, and I used to be a movie executive. So for 15 years, I was in the film business and I made movies as a studio executive. And my last job was senior VP of MGM. And then I stepped off and I got a PhD in developmental psychology here at UCLA. And I loved every minute of it. And I worked for Common Sense Media for a while. I wrote a book called Media Moms and Digital Dads. And then I launched the center in 2019 to really bring research insights and research tools to storytellers, in particular, storytellers who make content for young people, adolescents. And we define adolescents ages 10 to 25. The National Academy of Science is really saying that that's the age of adolescence now, because it starts as soon as puberty, which can hit as young as 10, and it goes through the time where some of the brain structures are more fully developed and connected, which can happen as late as 25 or even later. So we really have an important time span, and we believe that adolescence is a critical time period for development. It's just as important as early childhood, and these the things that happen during this time period when media is everywhere and so important, and friends are really important, it can really shape a life. So media does have the power to positively impact young people. Of course, it has the power to negatively impact young people or all of us. But there is a lot of research that shows how you can use media to positively impact people, young people, and how you can use it to teach them things. And we talk about smuggling the message in. So we know that as a former storyteller, I know that didactic storytelling doesn't work, especially for adolescents, but you can tell stories, and hopefully the toolkit that we offer will help you tell stories in a way that will teach young people these kinds of things in a positive way. So I'm going to quickly share screen and show you the toolkit, and then we're going to have a discussion about it. So we'll drop this in the chat, but this is the place that you find it. You can find it on our website if you go to Center for Scholars and Storytellers. And what you'll see is this toolkit for storytellers that has different research insights on how to integrate curiosity, gratitude, and humility into your content. So, and then you can go to each individual page and find some more information. But we give you some reasons, and Dr. Hines said these are incredibly important character strengths to help young people foster self-awareness, positive relationships, deeper understanding of the world, and help them with their emotional and social growth. And we feel that this is important because media can capture it. And we look at different intersections in this toolkit. So what's a little bit different about this, we also look at how learning curiosity might differ based on race or based on gender. So you'll see, or even ability. So you'll see different kinds of intersections. We offer you different resources. Here's the list and the recommendations for families. And this is the Choose Kindness project, which has playbooks that are all for parents to help support them as they teach their children kindness and support children who are bullied. So we did a study earlier this year where we found that content that Common Sense had tagged for having positive character virtues made more money at the box office, and it could make as much as $50 million more. So this is what we found, that if a movie was not tagged with character strengths, this is how much it made at the box office worldwide on average. But when it was tagged with having these actual character strengths, they could make as much as $87 million at the box office, $50 million more than a movie that did not have character strengths. And these were all equally reviewed, so it was not taking into account review. And you can see that some of the biggest difference happens in this global arena. Internationally is where the biggest difference is. And that's because values are evergreen, they hold, they are representative across the world. So they're really, you know, in particular, if you integrate these values into your content, you know, it should help you appeal across the world. We also did several wonderful interviews with people like Meg LaFauve, who wrote in the Inside Out, and she is Inside Out coming out again, and with Dr. Meg Rainey from Yale. We had an actor from Bel Air talk about some of these character strengths, and Janet Yang. So there's lots of different videos where we talk in depth, like we're going to talk a little bit today, about different character strengths and how to integrate it into content. And finally, there are tip sheets. Each of these are free. They're on our site. They give you all different ways to support this. This is about curiosity, how to help young people develop, and in how to help media, how to integrate curiosity and stimulate curiosity through the content that you're creating, and sort of do it in an original way, in a more positive way. And we have the same things, and as I said, it's free on the site. We have the same thing for gratitude, we have it for humility, and there's a whole bunch of different resources on this site. So I hope you will take a chance to take some time to look through it, and give us your feedback. Let us know if you're looking at it. And now we're gonna start the conversation. So come on back, Dr. Hines, and everyone else.
Thank you so much, Dr. Uhls, for that amazing introduction to the toolkit. There's so much rich stuff in there. It's really actionable, it's really thoughtful and deliberate, and I just know how much work went into it. And so it's really great to see this come together and to be able to be shared with the world.
And I want to actually give a shout out to Emma Terrell, who led this work and did a lot of that work of figuring out the research. She was a fellow and a manager who worked with us.
Definitely. Shout out to Emma. So now we'll have kind of a general panel discussion with our panelists here today. And we also have collected a few audience questions, but I think you'll have an opportunity later to submit some questions if anything comes up throughout the conversation. So as Dr. Uhls said, thank you all for being here. So I think all my panelists have joined at this point. So I'm going to start kind of with a general thought about the toolkit. Something that jumped out to me that seems like kind of a foundational principle for the toolkit is this quote that I pulled from one of the documents. It says, "In the past, parents have relied on family, religion, and schools to impart character lessons. But as media increasingly permeates the fabric of social life, it becomes another powerful tool for promoting positive character development." So as Dr. Uhls mentioned in her introduction, there is still a lot of fear and anxiety around the prevalence of media and the place that, you know, it holds in our lives, and especially in the lives of young people. And so this toolkit kind of takes a completely different approach and, you know, kind of says that we have power and that we have, you know, kind of a say in how media does impact young people. And so I just wanted to hear some general perspectives on that point, or on that tension and that conflict that we're kind of experiencing from all the panelists.
I'm happy to jump in. I think that obviously there's great, you know, anxiety from all places around sort of teens, especially use of media, social media in particular. But I think also just what kinds of content are they being exposed to? One of the things, and it probably goes a little more towards the younger teens, is that they are often watching programming that's not made specifically for if we're identifying an adolescent at 10 or 11 or 12, that's quite different developmentally from a 15 or a 16-year-old, and yet they are lumped in and being, if not directed, at least finding out about content that is really not necessarily made for where a 10 or 11-year-old might be. So I think the concern is real. I think the you know, the opportunity is to create shows and to create content that keeps that in mind, so that there is an awareness of exactly who's watching your show, and feel the responsibility in creating those shows that really reflects who your audience is in a authentic way. Because I think even 10-year-olds, even 5 and 6-year-olds can sniff out if something feels manufactured and doesn't feel real and feels like it's been created in a corporate conference room. So it has to feel real, it has to feel authentic. But I think making sure that it also feels appropriate and responsible is key to finding a pathway to be able to give kids content that can have a positive impact on them, that doesn't scare them, that doesn't give them the wrong message, that has a thoughtful way of explaining some of the things that they're thinking about. And that's the responsibility of producers. It's also the responsibility of broadcasters, and I use that in the broadest term now. It's not just the linear channels, it's also the streamers, it's also social media, it's YouTube, it's TikTok, it's wherever kids are finding stories and characters, whether they're scripted and fictional characters, or they're characters that spring in some way from real people, to make sure that there is that awareness of just what the impact is, and take that responsibility really seriously. It's not easy, because most of our businesses are profit making. They're looking for, how do we get the most eyeballs? How do we have, make kids tune in over and over and over again for our stories? And things that have high stakes, things that seem a bit salacious, things that are sort of like, oh, I'd like to see the inside of that kind of lifestyle, are often, a little more compelling than seeing just an everyday story that you feel kind of reflects exactly what you're going through. But I think there have been plenty of examples, even in the last, couple of years, where those stories that feel like they reflect real life also have been able to gather big audiences and put forth some of those positive messages.
Sarina, you want to weigh in?
I'd be honored. I think to add on to that, I think connecting with the audience is like the best way to implement what you want to get through your shows. Like, people have this idea about how teens are like angsty, focused on school, social media, but they connecting with people who are actually watching it would allow them to like realize who's watching their show and what they want to see, and they can connect to it too. And or like Nancy said, to draw inspiration from that to change the story so people can feel connected and represented in what they see. Yeah.
Love that. Yeah. I think that, I think about that third space. We just released a study called Teens and Screens that got worldwide press attention. We had 2.1 billion possible impressions of it, 32 countries. And our Gen Z authors, who were the first and second author, wrote a really pretty beautiful essay, which we can put the link into the chat, as well as our Teens and Screens. And basically, they talked about media being the third space, and you talked about sort of, school, religion, church, clubs, all these places. And this isn't anything new. I mean, there's a sociologist called Robert Putnam who wrote about, he wrote a book called Bowling Alone in the 90s, about how these places to gather were disappearing in America, and they've only contracted further and further. And so media now is that third space, meaning that home is your first space, work is your second space, and media is your third space. And that is where young people gather, and that is where they connect, and that is where they find community. And if that is where they're gathering and finding community, look at us right now. We are gathering on this virtual screen. Then let's try to make that content and the time that they're spending in this third space as productive as possible.
Thank you. I think that was a great opener, and everyone kind of touched on a lot of the things that we'll dive a little more deeply into. So kind of, Nancy, you talked a little bit about this, the role of the storyteller and the producer and the people who are creating this content. And I want to think about this specifically in relation to the mental health crisis, or the mental health challenges that young people are facing. So seeing this media that is being produced that promotes positive character virtues, do you see it as an intervention, or do you see it as something else, like kind of I see it as the world or society has kind of failed young people in a lot of ways, right, through different structures and institutions. And so do you see media as kind of an intervention in that failure, I guess? And should storytellers adopt that attitude as they're creating content for adolescents? And this is for everyone, but kind of related to Nancy's point.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean by an intervention. I think there's definitely more attention being paid now to what some of the negative impacts can be to young people through content. And I think there is a growing sense of the power that, you know, these shows and producers have. So I think if you look at some of the things, you look at some shows where they try to normalize teen behavior and not necessarily stigmatize teen behavior. I think, you know, in the past there was always, well, this is this one, this is that one. And I just a recognition that, you know, teens today, if not everybody today, can have, you know, different facets. It doesn't necessarily quantify you as only one thing, whether that's your sexuality, whether that's your personality, whether that's an element of mental health that doesn't seem quote unquote normal, whether that's eating disorder, you know, you name it. And so I think there is, you know, an attempt to sort of bring a truth to that isn't sensationalized, and that can make, as you know, to what Sarina said, is just make it feel like you're really connecting to your audience on the level that they are looking for, and that it makes authentic sense to them that these stories, these characters are being portrayed in that way. You know, that being said, you know, I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna about it, but because, you know, the business is what the business is, that you know, the first and foremost is how do we bring an audience to this? But I think the more content that's out there, I think of something like the series Heartstopper. I'm sure plenty of people in the audience know that, which did so well on Netflix where it was released, and is such a loving and supportive and, you know, graceful series about that age, about that coming of age, about that coming out, getting comfortable with who you are, understanding who you are. When those things like that succeed, it inspires and it gives everybody else a little bit of confidence that, gee, we can make content like that. I think we just need more of it that that does reflect those kinds of really true values and characters, to get people motivated to say these shows can do good and also do well.
Sarina, I'm curious if you, what you think of, if you watch Heartstopper, and what you think, you know, I was telling a storyteller today about some of our findings from Teens and Screens, and I got feedback of like, well, was that self-report? Is that just what they say, but do they really watch that stuff? You know, because we found your generation, you know, and you know, this was 1,500 young people from across the country, are very clear on what they want. It came out in our data, but you know, that's the question. Do you really do what you're saying you want? Curious about that.
I never watched Heartstopper. I should though, because I lost Netflix. It was really scary because of the whole password sharing thing. But I think that show did a great job of taking a topic that needs to be discussed and putting it in a way for viewers like me to like connect with it and relate to it, even though it wasn't us directly. And wait, what was your question again? I'm so sorry.
Just do you want to watch, you know, would you want to watch shows that, you know, portray positive values, portray connection, portray characters being, you know, curious about things, grateful for each other, things like that?
Honestly, yes, because it makes you like you look up to what you see in media because like media for me personally, it's like, well, these characters, they went through so much and I admire them. And I think having someone to watch you connect with them like on a personal journey throughout the show and seeing them go through stuff that you have to go through or you have gone through, it makes you feels connected. I'm saying that word so much, but it's so true because what you see kind of makes you who you are. And like growing up, I never had like a Persian character to look up to. But with shows like Never Have I Ever, like starting to go more into going against that stereotype of a Middle Eastern or South Asian person, you look up to the character's traits because you feel validated for the ones that you have. That's what I personally believe.
Yeah,
Hope
that
that
makes
answers
a
your
lot of
question.
sense. And I was to Nancy's point about sort of people, you know, like it's not that one, this character is that, this character is that. I remember working with Tim Federle, or not really working with him, but we did a workshop that Nancy brought us on to do at Disney. And Tim Federle, who wrote the series, High School Musical series, Olivia Rodrigo's big breakout show, um, he came to he had already written the first season, which was really good. And then he came to our workshop, and one of the things he took away was um, that he should be working on these secondary characters and giving them more rounded personalities. So it's not the nerdy kid or the black kid or the Persian kid, that they had much more rich identities. And our workshop director independently had been watching season 2 and had noticed how much richer and how much, you know, the portrayals of all the characters were amazing. And Tim said part of that was because he came to our workshop and was inspired. And he did the work with his team, but yeah, I think people are looking for these counter stereotypical portrayals that are much richer.
And I think just, you know, adding on to that, Yalda, we're all multifaceted human beings, right? We're not just one thing. And I think that's always been the trickiest part of, you know, story development in film and TV is, you know, just saying, well, we need you know, you need the best friend, and the best friend is going to be cute, maybe a little overweight, and glasses. And, you know, and then you're going to need the nerd or the outsider, or you're going to need the one who's the rebel. And I think those stereotypical attributes have really broken down, certainly since, you know, in the cave days, my generation, where, you know, there wasn't the kind of crossover. You were either a jock, or you were an artsy person, or you were the smart, nerdy person. I from my experience and what I've observed, those sort of very hard and fast barriers have really broken down and broken apart. Whereas, you know, nerds seem to be the cool kids now. And, you know, just I think developing character with that in mind, that they don't have to be just black and white characters. They can really have multifacets to their personalities and interests.
And to add to that, I think also like when there's always like one stereotype, and if you fall in that stereotype, like for race, for example, like when you're only portrayed in a certain way, you feel like that's what you're gonna be. That's what everyone sees you as. Like if you're seen in the media this way, people in society will see you this way. And I think like what you said, breaking through that stereotype and showing that just because you have glasses and you have good grades doesn't mean you're only going to be that nerd. You can also play sports. You can also do art. You can also have interests like that aren't typical that you see in the media, because the media has a large audience, and having a certain label that people fall in and only showing that label, it it defines you. And having traits that stand out, I think, can be really important to showing others that you can be anything you want, honestly, and it's not what people define you as stereotype.
Yeah, I love that. And sorry, Alicia, I love though that we're just talking. I love that. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly why we really focus on adolescence, because I think at your age in particular, you're figuring out who you are. And in the past, it was sort of, I am the nerd, so I must be X. And there still are those stereotypes out there in the real world, but we're starting to try to shape them differently, and people are, you know, learning different things. And because of social media, you know, we sort of can see a broader variety of different kinds of people. And it's really, really critical as you figure out your identity and who you want to be, and for you to see more representation of all kinds of young people for you to relate to.
No, this is great. making it very easy. So I think I'm going to jump around a bit. This is getting into a lot that I wanted to talk about, but I'm hoping, Yalda, that you can speak a little bit, since we're talking about kind of diversity and representing different kinds of folks, why it was important for you and the authors of the toolkit to consider how character virtues are perceived or expressed differently by people from different backgrounds.
Yeah, and it was really an aha for me because we're typically taught that everyone should be curious and everyone should be humble. In America, there's this big sort of stoic, it's I'm a good person, and if I'm just quiet and I'm humble. And the authors and Emma and some of our advisors, we had some really, really great advisors, um, thought about and in fact, Lindsay Duran was one of our advisors, and she's an amazing filmmaker. And she was talking about how being humble as a woman is not, you're not going to be rewarded for it. Women, I mean, I'm not arguing against not being humble, but many of these values and these, virtues have been developed and pushed by the majority of white males who are in power. And so these values have, been set for all of us. And we wanted to interrogate those values and think, is this value, and we found a lot of research that a woman who's humble, she's not, if you use Sheryl Sandberg's term, she's not leaning in, and then she's going to be penalized in the workforce because she's not speaking up. She's not, but then if she's speaking up or she's not humble, she's judged too. And like another one we looked at was curiosity, and we looked at that through the lens of race. And like a Black boy who is curious, and a white boy or a white kid who's out in their neighborhood and being curious about different things, or other neighborhoods, may not be penalized in the same way as a Black boy who might want to explore their neighborhood or explore a different person's neighborhood. So we sort of saw in the final one for there's quite a few of these for disability, gratefulness. We think everyone should be grateful, but the community, if people who have disabilities, a lot of them are tired of having to always be so grateful for access. Like, thank you for giving me a wheelchair, ramp. Like, they're tired of being preached to as gratefulness is what you should, be thinking of. So really sort of some of our tips were like, consider this as you're trying to get across these kinds of different values. Consider how different races, ethnicities, abilities, sexual orientations might consider them. So they're really interesting tips, not only sort of, and we give some, like for curiosity, I think one of our tips was, I'll have to pull it up actually, but yeah, that was why we thought it was really, really important to consider this through different identities.
Yeah, thank you for that. And really quickly, Nancy, this is kind of related to another question that I had for you about how lessons are kind of infused in the storyline. So what does that look like when you're deciding this is kind of a moral lesson that we want to infuse, or a topic that we want to cover, and how the kind of characters or their situations or their conversations or the conflict that's happening between them, how that is sort of infused in the creative process and talk through, and how do you get to the point where you can actually portray that in a meaningful way on screen?
Yeah, it's really the trick and the thing that you're always aiming for. So if there is a specific theme or issue that we sort of know ahead of time we want to address in a series, say, which it's easier to talk through television series than movies per se. Often one of our first resources is to go to Yalda, or to go to wherever we can get real, clear, experienced, academic, verifiable, expert advice, so we know what we're talking about. So if it's, anything from suicide to gun control to, poverty, whatever, you really want to start with as much information as you possibly can. And then it's really, it's the job of the writers to figure out how to put that in without making it feel like it's a screaming message at you, because that will turn your audience off, especially a teen audience. If they can smell like, oh, here comes the lecture, they just tune out immediately. And so it really is, how do you make sure it comes from character? So it doesn't come on as a layer, like, and here's the message part. It really has to be built into the character from the beginning. And it has to be built into the story in a way that feels we've earned the reason why we're telling this story and why we're addressing this particular theme or issue. It's not, here comes the very special episode of this particular series, which again is just a big red flag for audiences. And that's the gift of working with great writers, is they can figure out how to do that.
And great producers like you.
Well, but I don't write the dialogue.
You're very humble.
And grateful.
Yeah.
So I think this leads well into a couple of questions I'm going to fuse together, and one of which is from one of our audience participants, which is I'm very grateful for. Thank you. And I'll just read this question first. The question from Michael Holton says, most storytellers today either avoid controversial topics or lean into liberal values. Can we find ways to present and explore both sides of issues inside the same story in this polarized world? And so I'm thinking about that in terms of like authenticity and, you know, how we tell the story in a way that resonates with someone like Sarina, but doesn't feel preachy. And then in the context, right, I always have like multi-layered questions, but in the context of a contracting market, entertainment industry, right, like does the industry have the capacity to kind of take on a story that would be so robust and so authentic and kind of show both sides? And do audiences kind of have the capacity to receive that kind of story right now, just from your opinion or perspective?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And I think it's a great question, because it's on everybody's mind now that I know of. We're all so tired of the polarization, and we realize just what kinds of things are tearing, us apart. And I think everybody who really cares about making shows is trying to figure out, so how do we avoid that? How do we not make, well, this is a show just for the coast, how do we make this a show that feels right, no matter where you live, in the country, in the world? And I think you're able to do that. I think Heartstoppers did it really well, right? It's one of the things I think they did. They took this very sensitive and authentic look at two boys who were struggling with different things at the same time. And it felt so, again, for me, it felt so real and so, deftly handled. And you see a big audience. I don't think everybody who saw that show and where the audience came from was either a queer person or a kid who was thinking about coming out or struggling with, coming out or their sexuality. In fact, I know from some of the Netflix data going back that there were huge audiences in sort of 18 to 25-year-olds. So it wasn't just, you weren't just talking to 15 and 16-year-olds, even though that was the age of the characters. So I think there's a real interest. I was just actually had a pitch for a movie last week, and we mentioned something very lightly about one of the main characters' faith, her faith, and the executives immediately started talking about, gee, how do we take that and make this, what is otherwise could be a somewhat controversial subject, feel like it can talk to both sides of people who might have questions about sort of women's reproductive rights. And I think, that was unique to that particular story, but I think there is a real interest, growing interest to the part of executives and broadcasters to say, how do we make shows that do appeal to a broad audience, that we're not segmenting it out and we're not laying the message on so heavily that it's going to turn off an audience who doesn't happen to have that same belief. But it's hard. But I think it is a goal. I really do.
Yeah, I'm gonna just jump in because Norman Lear, Sarina, do you know who Norman Lear is?
Yes, he's a mastermind.
Not too many people do from your age group, but for those of you who are storytellers, I'm sure you do. He wrote he wrote at a time when the country was really polarized and people were not talking to each other. And we'll drop in the chat a piece that I wrote for the conversation, where we were really talking about, that was a unique period of time. And Norman Lear really fought against with a lot of other people, but he fought against, sort of the network saying, this is too racy. This is too, we don't want a character like Archie Bunker, who is as conservative as you could be. And he even fought and even my stepfather, who just read my article, was like, I'm not sure Archie Bunker was a good role model. But at the same time, Norman fought against it and said, look, even a racist, bigoted guy has some parts of him that are lovable, and it's real, and it's messy, and it's families, and it's conflict, and it resonated, and it brought people together to talk about it. And I feel we're at that part of, we're in the world in the same place right now, right? Where there's so much conflict and so many people that are angry with each other, and comedy and drama and conflict and life in all its messiness is what we need.
And to add, sorry.
I was going
to.
you.
Thank you. I think also like having a character who's like perfect or just like the rebel or just the villain, that doesn't really come across well. Having a character who's multifaceted, has faults and strengths, I think that's really like applies to an audience and connects with them.
And I was going to ask, sort of in addition to that, Sarina's, how you as a young person perceive when certain issues, controversial issues, are represented on screen, or can you think of any example of where you think they did something really well, or where it hit you kind of strange because it didn't feel authentic or felt preachy or felt like it was one side of the story? Any kind of big issue, right? Like war, climate change, or social justice, or anything like that. And how do you receive that as a young person?
For me, the first example I can think of is the monologue from Barbie when Gloria talks about how females are treated in society, and it talked about feminism very well and how it like I cannot relate to her as a person, but I can relate to her as a woman, and how like she voiced the feelings about not being good enough, or being humble and grateful, and you can't fight against what people think because then you're going to seem like you're not grateful. And I think that just connected very well, and it was relatable too. Like as it went, like in a story in Barbie Land, you wouldn't expect that to ever happen, but it connected, and I think it went well with the plot and the point of Greta Gerwig's film. Yeah.
Thank you. So Michael Holden has responded, and I think it's related to another question that I had about authenticity, right? And how you do this well, and what resonates with audiences. And so Michael says here that people in reality may be 2/3 stereotype and 1/3 something unexpected. If the storytellers make everyone only unique and display unexpected characteristics, do we risk losing audiences because these characters are not actually authentic? They're kind of these, and I kind of understand that question to say, when you create this person that has everything, right? They cover all the bases. They have maybe a disability, and they're a person of color, and then they also are, trying out for, I don't know, the football team, right? Or something like that, right? And they just cover all the bases. Is that authentic? Because folks are just trying to represent different backgrounds and different experiences, and does that push us kind of further away from where we're trying to get, which is a reflection of real life?
Yeah, I don't think the intention is to make everyone an amalgam of half a dozen different things. What you're looking for is the specificity in a character. You want them to be specific, but that there's a universality to them so that you can relate to them, even though they are specific. That's you look for that in a story, you look for that in character. It's like you want to tell a story about a very specific set of characters in a specific time, in a specific place, with a specific problem of one sort or another. But it should be something that even if you don't share all of the qualities of obviously every one of the characters, or you don't live in that place, or you've never had to face that very specific particular issue, there's something in it that touches you as being very real. So it's not to make just like a dog's breakfast of characters by saying just throw everybody's everything. But I think you also want to avoid just saying like, all, tall, skinny girls are popular, with blonde hair and blue eyes and long legs. And you want to avoid saying, all jocks are stupid and, sort of unmindful. It's really, it's the nuance in character that you're looking for, but within a specificity and within an understanding that you can be a jock and love to play the piano. You go back to Happy Days, and that you didn't see that in storytelling by and large. So anyway, I think that's what we're all after. It's not a watering down of everything, for sure.
And I mean, stereotypes are rooted in reality. I mean,
Sure.
they are part of who we are, and many of us have biases, and many of us, are, certain pieces of us probably fit with part of a stereotype. And the problem is, I think, when they are very, you know, they're sort of used tritely and not really thought through, because sometimes you can put a stereotype in and then the storyteller can interrogate it in a way, and it might be a way to sort of, and I feel like Dear White People might have done that, like where you're sort of playing a stereotype and then you're kind of making it humorous, right? And you're making fun of Archie Bunker was a stereotype, right? And so when you push the stereotype to the nth degree, but you have other characters commenting on it, it can be a bridge to sort of questioning the stereotype and also, questioning that point of view. So I think there are places you can add stereotypes, and then there are places that, that you can sort of make fun of them in a way.
Yeah, definitely depends on the kind, if you're doing that big, broad-based comedy, you're going to approach it in one way. If you're doing a more thoughtful and gentle kind of, dramedy, I think you're just, but even in the big, broad comedies, the ones that work, you find the humanity, even in those, the most stereotypical characters. What you're hoping, what makes them resonate for you is finding that touch point that makes them human and not just a stock character.
And to add, I think when the films they try to put like a character like fits like what they have to include, it doesn't come across well. Like having like a Persian student's different from having a student who's Persian. You shouldn't make that the focus of the character, their race. It should be who they are in society, how they act, who they are as a person, and not their race or the way they dress. It should be more it's how they actually who they are as a person, and then add or get the point across with another message or including diversity by making anyone be those characters, not a certain type of person.
Well, like that's what Never Have I Ever was like, right? So even though she was South Asian, she, and that came across very clearly cultural in sort of the her family and many of them, but the grandmother was hilarious, and she did sort of different sort of counter things, even though certain ways she wears sari and she was very, very typical. In other ways, she was very, very funny. And so was the lead character, right? She was kind of nerdy, but then she got really popular and cool, and she was still herself. And her ethnic and race identity surfaced in different ways.
And so we talked a little bit about the kind of contracting YA TV market. And so I'm curious from both your perspectives, Nancy and Yalda, from like an executive perspective, right? Like what patterns, I guess, are you seeing in the content that's being picked up now and produced now? If you see any patterns across YA content, in terms of what resonates with audiences or what executives believe resonates. And then Sarina, what are you seeing sort of across what you're watching? If you can identify kind of any patterns of new content that catches your attention and grabs, the attention of you and your peers, if you see any patterns across that in terms of what resonates with you all.
Sarina, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think a common trend has been like Never Have I Ever, having more characters who can connect to others. and more about like everyday life. Like I do not think what happened to the main character will have ever happened to me, but I think just how it kind of it's not like she goes to school, she comes home. It's more like her quirks coming through in her daily life. And I think just that new trend of having an accurate representation of how it is to be a teen nowadays. And some shows too, they're including like COVID-19 and how that impact teens or recent events. And these all shape us. And I think that new trend of having more up to date things that have impacted the characters, I think that's a really good thing that I've noticed and can definitely be still improved on, but I think it's a great start.
Yeah, I love Never Have I Ever. It's such a good show. On more of a sort of, overview kind of macro level, I think one of the trends, and I sort of alluded to it in the beginning, is I do feel like there's less of a focus and less of an appetite for shows that feel like they are just simply geared towards a teen audience, because I think what broadcasters, streamers, platforms are seeing is that you can make a show that is really geared for, say, an 18 plus, that sort of YA, has a very YA. So they're not necessarily in high school. It's not about, as we used to call them, halls and malls. But they are sort of, older, they're post high school, sometimes even post college, and that those stories will bring in even as young as 10, 11, or 12. And so from a business perspective, people are saying, well, if we can get kids, as young as 10 or 11 or 12 to watch these shows that we know will also get that 18 to 35-year audience, why do we need to make shows that are really just geared for that pure adolescent of, 10 to 16? So it's getting, honestly, truthfully, harder and harder to sell a show that is very centered on just a teen set of characters, unless there really is a very compelling reason why you think you're going to be able to bring something of a somewhat older audience to it as well. I think Never Have I Ever, again, a lot of that audience was not a high school audience. It was, older. Some of it came because of Mindy Kaling, and some of it came just because, the content really resonated. But I think, it's from a purely business outlook, I think it is a bit more of a challenge these days than, say, it was in the height of the Nickelodeon and Disney Channel days, when they were making, one sitcom after another, and the audience was just that teen, tween, young teen and tween audience. It's much harder to get those shows. And when they've tried, they haven't really been successful. So I think it does signal a change in that audience appetite. To Sarina's point, I think they want things that feel less shiny and perfect, and everybody lives in a house in Pasadena with a yard and a room that's decorated to the nines. I think they want it to feel a little more relatable and a little more diverse, which is great. So I think comedy is, something that is also elevated more so than it was when we were just in that sort of multicam sitcom world. I think they're looking for the comedy to come from different places and be a little more sophisticated, come more from character and less from situation. So those are just two sort of general trends that I've noticed.
Y'all, do you see any trends on your end, or you good on that question?
I mean, I think Nancy, I think about adolescent programming, and I think that intergenerational sort of programming that maybe somebody young can watch with an older audience might be okay, but I wonder, might be okay in terms of impact, in terms of how it impacts the young person. And often those a kind of show that meets that both generations or different ages has these sort of character strengths and values integrated, so they're things we all recognize in ourselves. But I wonder about, I mean, obviously those Disney and Nickelodeon shows, they wouldn't resonate today because they do feel very cookie cutter and very stereotypical and sort of a very specific way of thinking. And I wonder if people are underestimating the audience, that one, that they're underestimating what they're ready for, and two, they're underestimating that it's there, and that if we created content for them, would they come in droves? You know, and I don't know if it's got to be content that's just created for, 10 to 18 or something like that, or 10 to 25 like we say, which is very broad range, or if it's content that has, is appropriate for someone who's younger, but somebody is older could watch it as well, like Never Have I Ever. I don't know, Nancy, if you think that there is the possibility of creating content for that age group that could succeed in the market, and it's just that people aren't willing to see that.
I think there's probably, I think there is more opportunity than maybe we're being given at this moment in time, because so many of those shows that felt like they were just made for that teen audience didn't succeed. So of course everybody says, oh, well, then that's not going to work. I just think it has to be better content, more, it has to bring something to the table that gives the younger kids that same feeling of excitement and originality that they get from older things. You look at something like Wednesday, there's really not much in Wednesday that, is totally inappropriate for a 10 or 11 or 12-year-old, but, it can bridge much, much broader than that. So I feel like there's opportunity, and I think that audience, certainly on the younger side of adolescent, in some way would like the relief of saying, let me just watch something that sort of is made for me. We all like to, I think, you always think about watching Up, and kids definitely watch Up. Sarina, I'm sure you can speak to that as well. But there's also, I think, great comfort that you see when kids are watching things that feel very familiar and comfortable and cozy for them. So I do think there's that opportunity.
And then they'll watch it again when they get older. Nostalgia.
Yep.
Yeah, this is kind of related to our last two questions. I apologize. Someone had a question that I put in the answer section, but it was about AI and how AI might contribute to trends that we're seeing in television and film. And I asked them to clarify a bit if they had an opportunity to do so. And then the second one was about a lot of content being based on IP. And so if people are creating content based on IP, how can you make the case or the argument that these character strengths and virtues should be infused in those storylines if it's not baked in from the beginning?
I mean, I think something like Wednesday is a perfect example, right? That's based on IP, but they really took the charge seriously to make this feel like it's not the original cartoons, it's not the movie, it's not the musical, it's not the old TV show. They really wanted to make it feel as relevant and make her as relatable a character, as kooky and as a character as she is, and nobody has her experience per se, but I think they took it very seriously to address something that would feel incredibly relevant and relatable. So I don't think or Barbie, for instance, is sort of like
Barbie.
Perfect example. Like, I didn't have much expectation that I would like a Barbie movie, but she made a super, super smart movie that absolutely infused, modern sensibility and modern themes and questions and character traits into the biggest IP probably in the world.
Well, and yeah, even like Disney movies, like, I mean, that are based on Grimm's fairy tales, or really, if you do not infuse modern thinking into them, I think, nobody wants to see a princess movie where she's weak and gets saved by the man. This is not something you can do, and you cannot sort of have those old-fashioned values. Wow, lots of questions coming in right as we're ending.
Yeah, just quickly, I don't know, Nicole and Hillary, you can let us know if we need to stop, but I can just read them off really quickly. So Noelle says, to what extent do you think creating media that incorporates the difficult, more edgy topics for youth might facilitate rumination rather than help them cope and act as a guide? So maybe pushing people toward engaging in certain activity, and I think we have some data on that. Yeah, how can you help creators toe that line? And then another is that as storytellers, how do you suggest we deal with the power of the studios that have the power that they have to control how stories are told. So when they toss out a story because it isn't relatable to the gatekeepers, or that a story is relatable but not entertaining. So people who get to make those decisions at the top, how do we get to them? Okay, we've got a couple of minutes, so I think we'll maybe answer these last couple of questions and then we can wrap up.
I can take the last question about what happens when the gatekeepers toss your story out. That is the job of the producer to convince them that there is a way to do this that is in their best interest. You win some and you lose some. And certainly as a producer, and even as an executive who had to convince and justify decisions that I had to make, that's part of your job, is to be able to put forth an argument that for keeping something that you feel is really meaningful and worthwhile, and you have to be able to support your case, and then hope you have open-minded people who are willing to be flexible. And I've certainly found that more often to be true than not. Certainly there are times when there are things, you know, you work for a company like Disney and you know that there are some things that are possible to push and stretch the brand, and then there are some things that aren't. But I think we were, you know, successful. We did in Andy Mack, you know, we were the first TV show to have a character actually say, "I'm gay." I mean, this goes back, you know, 9 years ago, 8 years ago, but it was a big deal. It hadn't ever been said on a Disney Channel television show. Even in much younger content that I was part of, we had stories with two moms. So, you know, you chip away at it and you just find the right time. And sometimes that's not exactly the moment that you would like it to be, but you just try and find the right moment to push your case forward. And you just, if you're
Soldier on.
yeah, you just soldier on. It's part of the business. You're not going to get a yes all the time. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, it's everything that you know is worth it. You just got to pick yourself up. One rejection, if you get easily rejected and give up, this is not the business for you. But I would say also at the center, we really try to provide business reasons. So, you know, if you're trying to tell a story about somebody from a different race or ethnicity or different, you know, sexual orientation, we have data that shows this might make more money, or we just started with the character strengths, you know, something that integrates these character strengths, and you feel your show really integrates, you know, teaching someone about being grateful, or message you can show, you can point to. It's just one data point. You have to have a really good story, but you can say, look, you know, this data shows that movies that do this make more money, in particular internationally, you know, and we have that for race and ethnicity. We have what teens are saying they want. We're actually being brought into studios to tell people, give that guidance. So use our data if you can, or reach out to us. And then the last thing I would say about the ruminating, that's a really good question. And I think this is why we're really leaning into content around the story. So a story might get someone curious, and an adolescent curious about a particular issue. Our data has found that, but they may not understand it. And if you create content around it where someone could dig deeper into it, so let's say it's about an eating disorder, Ginny in Georgia, there was an eating disorder or self-harm, and you have something like that. If there's a something on social media where somebody's talking about it and it's connected to the show, you can really get them, you can do the coping and acting as guides in these sort of ancillary pieces around the show. And we're really trying to get studios to think about that, because we're, you know, in 2023, there's so many different ways you can create conversation and around content, and you can get accurate information, and that will engage your audience more. So that was a really good question, Noelle.
No, I think that's a great question. I'd love to have Sarina have the last word on that as well, right? So when you're watching things that, you know, maybe are depicting certain kinds of behavior, maybe negative behavior and negative outcomes, how does that affect you? Like, has it ever, you know, led you to learn more or to make a different kind of choice than you would have made?
I think it simply all comes down to the way it's portrayed in the media. Like that, for example, like having a show that shows it as like a here, like this character it doesn't come across that well. You might be curious. Like I was so curious because I'm interested in psychology, so I want to learn more about it. But for other people, I think this having a character who is living life, but having this also additional struggle, I think that comes across much more important. And for people who deal with that, they feel validated too, instead of just like including it as part of the script. I think just making it like integrated more in the plot and like showing the impact it has on someone rather than just like someone has this. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think the research that the center's done on like euphoria, for example, some of the young people were they weren't actually led to, you know, use drugs or anything, like engage in any of that the activity that was portrayed, and because it was portrayed in kind of a really raw visceral sort of way. So anyway, I think this was a really great conversation. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you again to everyone at Life Sciences for helping us put this together, and especially to our audience for joining us. We hope everyone checks out the links and looks at the toolkit, uses it, shares it around. Yalda, do you have any last words?
No, I just thank you. We'll be sending around the video and some links to all the people who signed up as well, and people had to drop early. You'll get all of it. And thank you. Please reach out anytime.
Thank you. Bye.